I'd like to welcome on behalf of the linguistics program, and of which I am the chairman, Clyde Thogmartin, and also on behalf of the Graduate College, the University Committee on Lectures, and the departments of English, Foreign Languages, and Speech, all of which are the co-sponsors of this lecture. This is the inaugural linguistics lecture. I have avoided the word first annual linguistics lecture because we don't know yet, but we hope that this will become an annual event, that we can invite a major scholar in the field of linguistics, in the various fields that are broadly defined as linguistics in the United States, and ask him to make an address at Iowa State. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Frederick Cassidy. Dr. Cassidy comes to us from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He is the editor and director of the Dictionary of American Regional English. I'm not going to give you a whole curriculum vitae for Dr. Cassidy. If you're here, that is sufficient tribute to the fact that you're aware of his scholarship and that you're interested in what he has to say. I'm just going to say that Dr. Cassidy spoke this afternoon to my class of 3 students in historical linguistics, and all 4 of us were fascinated with what he had to say, even though he's not a Romance linguist, which is the subject matter of the course, and that because of that, I'm looking forward to the speech which he is going to give tonight. The subject which Dr. Cassidy has announced is Our Language, Flourishing or Dying. Thank you. Dr. Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Thogmartin. And I don't remember having been sponsored by so many departments before. This is quite flattering. Anyway, I plan to ignore this sign on the board, by the way. I've had uncertain feelings about what I wanted to talk to you about tonight, partly because I wasn't sure, and Mr. Thogmartin wasn't sure, quite what kind of audience would turn out. Now I see you are about halfway divided between students and faculty. So I ask the students not to think I'm talking down to them, and I ask the faculty not to think I'm talking down to them either. So I will try to keep it fairly non-technical, and yet I think there is such a tremendous lot of interesting stuff in the field of language. Needless to say, I'm an enthusiast, and all kinds of other things, an optimist and whatnot. I find language inexhaustibly interesting, language and languages, let's say. And so what I have to do really is to limit myself in some sort of way. I will tell you something about the dictionary I'm editing because that's on the top of my mind and all the time, night and day. And it's fascinating because it has to do with our current American English. But when Mr. Thogmartin asked me to state a subject, you know, you're on the telephone and he says, what are you going to talk about? And what do you say? Well, you give a perfectly safe kind of title that doesn't commit you too much but pulls people in by the dozens. And that's what I did. And then when I got to his office this afternoon, he showed me a blue page like that with the Old Glory waving in the middle of it like this. I don't know whether you've seen it. If you haven't, you should. Anyway, this is the American language definitely flourishing. He said they couldn't print my picture on it, so they put the flag on instead. Now the lecture begins. I receive all sorts of mail because of the dictionary. I'm trying to write a dictionary, to complete a dictionary, which has been going since 1965 under my direction. I've tried to write a dictionary about regional American English, which means not the words that people use throughout the country, but those that they use in one part or another of the country. Now, whether it's a very small part, such as just one community, or whether it's a huge region, such as the entire northern United States or the entire southern United States from one coast to the other coast. I've put everything under the word regional, because if I hadn't done that, the dictionary title would have looked like something out of the 17th century that covers the entire title page. You know those things, those wonderful 17th century title pages that go on and on. But I use the word regional simply to mean non-total, non-national. Any word that is used in only a part of the country, however small. Or else, then I extend it in another way. That's geographical. I extend it in the social dimension. And I say that if a certain group of people, limited in some way socially, a sub-community of some type, use a word or an expression that is not used by everybody in general, that also can be interpreted as being socially regional. At least it's socially limited. And that kind of limitation we have too. If you want to use a word that would subsume everything, I think you might use the word folk English. But it won't do very well in the United States because it's too limiting too. If we were talking about dialect, we'd have to be in some other country too, I think, than the United States, because dialect, when the word is properly used, I think refers to much older countries in which the population has been stabilized, at least the rural population, which until the late 19th century was all the population. The rural population was stabilized and didn't move about much, consequently, and their orbit of intercommunication was narrow, so that whatever came about in their language came about locally. And you could move from one section of the country to another, and you'd find everybody saying queer things because they weren't saying what you said. We have, of course, heard stories such as the story about the election of LBJ to the presidency, and, or I guess he wasn't elected, but he came into it. At any rate, somebody said from Texas, somebody from Texas said, well, at last we have a president who doesn't talk dialect. I think LBJ agreed with him. In any case, to use the word dialect in the United States is a little bit of a misnomer. We do have some words that are used in very small communities, in very narrow limits, and those you can call dialect legitimately. But we're not like, let's say, still the English and the French and the Germans and the Swiss, where every time you move about 15 or 20 miles, you find that the rural language has changed in many respects. It's not that it's totally unintelligible, but that they say things differently and they pronounce them differently, and maybe even their syntax is somewhat affected. Whatever it is, you can go from one end of the United States to another, and you'd really have to try hard not to make yourself understood in simple things, the things of every day. And this has been a fact that's been noticed by travelers to the United States for at least 2 centuries. They've been commenting on the fact that Americans have differences in their speech. Yes, that's admitted. Benjamin Franklin noted it himself. He was, of course, a Bostonian who went down to Philadelphia, and he noticed some differences on the way. But just the same, taking the country as a whole, in a very huge area compared with the dialect areas of older countries, not just Europe, but other places, North Africa, let's say. And you'll find that in the United States we have something very closely approaching a common language. But there still are a lot of these differences, and they should not, I think, be ignored. In fact, I think they're a little bit like the spice in a good dish. They give it a flavor. It's pleasant to be able to identify somebody from another part of the country, not only by asking him, what do you do, and so forth, but by hearing him speak, hearing her speak. One of the pleasures I've always had at the times of political conventions, this is going to come up again pretty soon, the times of political conventions, is hearing the delegates from this state or that state coming in and saying, I represent the sovereign state of Alabama, or something like that. And then, of course, the person coming in from Wisconsin and saying it another way. I won't imitate the Wisconsinites. But, but at any rate, hearing the sequence, the alphabetical sequence of the states, and the way the different delegates speak, they throw it on a little bit, of course, on purpose. They're making a show of themselves. They're representing this great state, and they want to be looked at. And so they exaggerate it slightly. But just the same, the basis of what they're exaggerating is real, and I think it's some of the flavor of American language. Now, in recent years, something else has happened to us, and that is to say that, well, let me read you a letter that I received. As I said, when writing for the dictionary, all kinds of people write things into us. As soon as somebody puts a little notice about us in a newspaper, and last November, it came into the New York Times, quite a good article written by a woman in Milwaukee, Joyce Laban Lewis. I say her name with pleasure and thanks because it's the best article that's been written about the dictionary. But in any case, her article came out in the New York Times and then was syndicated and spread all over the country. And I got countless letters, hundreds of letters from people who said this sounds like a very interesting project, and all but one letter was favorable. The one letter came from a gentleman who said that he thought it was an awful waste of public money to pay all those dollars to gather all this nonsense, arrant nonsense. Well, that's the way he wrote. Well, of course, I couldn't take that lying down. I wrote right back to him and batted his ears back as pleasantly as I could, and he wrote back and said he was eating crow. You know that expression, don't you? To eat crow. I hope so. It's a good United States invention, obviously from the frontier. If you had to eat something and you didn't have anything else, you ate crow. It was not pleasant, but it kept you alive. Well, anyway, this is one of the letters I received recently, 1979, from a lady in Denver. I won't give you her name. I know nothing about her except the way she wrote. She says, I read recently in the public press of some group which is going to try to abolish some of the phrases which litter our language, such as bottom line, point in time, hopefully, and several others. If only there could be a way to eliminate you know from the English language, it would be so nice. I'm furnishing her voice. Perhaps I'm exaggerating that too, but at any rate, it seemed to me that there was a little something plaintive in it. She wished that she could somehow get rid of those nasty expressions and have everything so nice. Well, I almost wrote back to her and told her the story of old King Canute, who put his throne on the sea's edge when the tide was coming in and demonstrated to his subjects that talking to the waves doesn't keep the tide from coming in, and that a king's power has its limitations. And I might say that trying to stop language when its time has come is futile. When a word has come and been adopted by everybody and is being used every day and is getting into the public prints and is being used by professors from platforms, how can you stop it? I'm talking, of course, about the word hopefully as an introductory word. Even the writer in the New York Times Sunday paper, William Safire, I hope you read his column every week, I religiously do. But in any case, Safire's column, Safire has said, I admit, he says, I'm a purist, but I admit that hopefully is in, and you can't do anything about it. It may die out, but I don't think it will because it's so useful. Now, I am still avoiding it personally, but that's because I know it so well. I know that it's not the English word hopefully, which is used in the sense of he looked hopefully at his paycheck or something like that, you know, hoping he'd had a raise. That's not the kind of hopefully I'm talking about. That's been in the language since Anglo-Saxon times. And that's got totally legitimate ancestry. But this other one, hopefully, is a new acquisition. And what it seems to be, I'm almost certain it is a direct translation from German, the word hoffentlich. has been simply brought right into English and calqued into English terms. Hoffentlich. You look it up in any of your German dictionaries you want to. I've checked it through in 3 or 4 of them. And that's exactly the way the Germans use it. They say, hoffentlich, heute ich will etwas, just whatever they want to say. But they mean, it is hoped, or I hope. It is to be hoped by me. And that's what they mean by it. Now, having such a large and avid audience, I will tell you the way one should say that. And you may spread the gospel if you wish. The word that you should be using is not hopefully at all, but hopedly. Because that, you see, says it precisely. It is to be hoped. Hopedly, this word will increase like the mustard seed. Well, the lady whose letter I read to you is surely expressing a point of view that a lot of people have. And I think she's being influenced by some of these people like, maybe not Sapphire, but let's say Edwin Newman and so on. Now, what they're saying, some of the things they're saying are perfectly good. They're excellent. I'm all with them in opposing governmental jargon, or governmentalese, as you call it, the kind of language which sounds as though it ought to mean something. But if you try to translate it, you find it come out, most of the time, an absolute zero. At least if you do translate it, it's so ridiculously simple that you don't believe they could intend to say that. Well, that kind of jargon is just so much verbosity, and it should be done away with if possible. I don't know how you do away with language. If somebody is going to talk that way, how do you stop them? Of course, you can fire them from a government job, but they just go out and get some other job and keep right on doing it, perhaps claiming that because they've been in government, this thing has some kind of kudos or something. Anyway, I don't know how you stop language. If it's there and if people find a use for it, and if they aren't going to be, let us say, socially harmed by it, then they'll use it. And most of the time, people use their language anyway without this kind of thinking beforehand, what effect is this going to have? They just talk. They just say what comes naturally or say what is automated into them already. We don't do a great deal of forethinking before we express ourselves, most of the time. This is certainly true at the colloquial level. The other thing that the so-called purists are, I think, absolutely right in is to say that we don't pay enough attention to good writing. Writing that's intelligible, that's clear, that's forceful, that's entertaining, that's at least that holds you, that makes you want to keep on reading. I think they're right on that most of the time, but then there are reasons why this thing happens. They seem to tend to say that the schools are all at fault, and that's why it's doing it. School teachers aren't doing their job, and that's why everybody writes so badly. First, everybody doesn't write so badly. There's still just about as much good writing being done as there ever was. There are more people trying to write, and there are a lot of people who shouldn't be writing who are trying it. But I think what that kind of person does is to overlook two things. One of them is that the ideals for writing that they hold up are somewhat antiquated. They are thinking in terms of the years of the 18th century especially, and perhaps the 19th century too, in which elegance was so much the important thing, and this was at an aristocratic level. If you were going to be a literary man, if you were going to be read by the elite, if you were going to be used in the court, and if you were a professional and so forth, then elegance was an extremely important thing. Euphony, a word that they used to say a great deal in the 19th century. Euphony was the basis on which you chose your words. Diction had to be so perfect and so forth. This sort of thing. I think we do it in different terms, at least today. It's obvious that if things sound better, they're going to make a better effect, so euphony does mean something, only we probably wouldn't use the word, and so forth. No question at all that clarity has certain advantages, though I have seen some speakers, heard some speakers, who kept attention not by speaking clearly, but by having some sort of personal idiosyncratic method of expressing themselves, perhaps a hack in their voice or some gesture that they use. This is not recommended in the books on rhetoric, but it's one of the factors that count. When you're writing, of course, that kind of thing is out of the question. But if writing is going to be good, first of all, people have to read. If you don't read, you'll never write well. Put that down if you want as the motto of this talk. If you don't read, you'll never write well. You have to read good writing too, if you're going to write well. But the more we pay attention to, let us say, television and the constant battery of news broadcasts and weather broadcasts that we get always in the same language, or virtually always in the same language, and the same thing over 6 or 7 times a day, obviously you're not going to keep freshness of expression in the forefront. The result is that we'd better read more widely and not do so much looking. And after all, you don't have to have weather reports more than once a day. At least I don't think you do. They're not always right anyway. So much for that kind of approach, the approach in which I think a rather outmoded approach to the business is that you have to have aristocratic language. The age has changed. This is not an aristocratic age. If you are an aristocrat, you will have gone to a private school and you will have learned private school writing, reading and writing and expression, and you will find yourself a member of a rather small group. And if you want to broaden your life, you'll have to learn some democratic language. Interestingly enough, the shoe's on the other foot, if you want to put it that way. On the other hand, democratic language tends to let itself go a little bit without discipline. And so you get sloppy stuff, badly expressed, badly written, badly said. And the cure for that, it seems to me, is, or the reason for that, at least as an English teacher, I would say, is that people haven't thought through what they want to express. They do it by formulas, which they've learned, which are more or less automatic. And the formula will help you to a certain extent, but formulas don't need to be clear, they just need to be formulaic. But if you want to teach a person to write well, the first thing you've got to do is to clarify their expression, the thinking behind the expression. They've got to be able to think logically, they've got to be able to think clearly, they've got to be able to think in an organized way. And after you've done that, if you've got their thinking processes straightened out, then you don't need to do much more with writing. Choice of vocabulary, yes. Expression of various sorts, where to put emphasis and so forth, yes. All those little things. But the basic thing is that the thinking should be clear, should be logical, should be forceful. All right. Should be compelling. I mean, the logic should be compelling. That kind of thing, then, we still have to pay attention to. And insofar as our schools are not succeeding in giving us that kind of thing, then they are at fault. But I also think about all the other pressures they're under, and I feel sympathy for them and can't blame them fully. I don't think that's the whole story. The public pressures on people that have nothing to do with good writing or even with clear thinking are very strong. I recommend that we all reread George Orwell on doublethink. 1984, the last part. Now let me get back then from these very general remarks and from the lady who would like to somehow get rid of the unpleasant things in our language. I don't think you can get rid of them. What you can do is to choose which of the enormous smorgasbord that lies before us in language, which of those things do I want to eat? I can't eat everything on the table. I don't like everything on the table. I would burst if I ate everything on the table. Let me choose the ones that I like. Have you ever seen a child perhaps, go through a cafeteria line for the first time? You will find an overloaded tray and surf it before it's half eaten. That's just bound to happen. We can do the same thing with language. Let me get back then from that very general sort of commentary to the question of my dictionary. I'm making a dictionary of regional English. It's been going since 1965. That sounds like an awfully long time to be working at one dictionary, doesn't it? I might recommend the fact that the big Oxford Dictionary, which is 13 volumes, and mine's only going to be 4, but the Oxford Dictionary in 13 volumes took 45 years to go through the press, through the process of printing. The first volume coming out in 1884, and the last volume coming out around don't calculate this too fast, I may be a year or two off, but about 1928. And then, of course, the supplement came out in 1932. That was the 13th volume. And they're now going into they finished the second volume of a 4-volume supplement that's coming out right now. The third volume is due in 1981, out of 4 supplementary volumes. Why do they have to have such a huge dictionary? Well, of course, the big Oxford was covering the entire range of the English language from Anglo-Saxon times forward, which is quite a stretch. The supplement is covering only those things which were modern things which were left out of the latter part of the big Oxford, and the things that have come into the language since then. The English language in all parts of the world, including, of course, our very big part of it, is increasing in the number of words to such and meanings, not only words, but new meanings for words or different meanings for words. It's increasing at such a rate that it's almost impossible for lexicographers, dictionary makers, to keep up with it. Have you seen the Barnhart Dictionary of new words from 1963 to just 10 years, to 1963 to 1973? It's a book with about, I think it's 750 pages of new words only and new senses. Of course, they put in quotations showing where the new words were used and how they're used and what their meanings are and so on. It's a regular historical dictionary kind of presentation, but just the same. 700 pages on words that have come in within a 10-year period, words and meanings. But that will give you a little index of the speed with which the language is being increased. A former student of mine, a former worker on the dictionary, sent me about a week ago from his electronics firm. He's moved to Chicago and he's working for an electronics firm. He sent me some glossaries that were made for that electronics firm, 6 of them. They're all the technical words that are being used by the electronics people now. And one firm, notice. Some of the others may have different terms, but in this one they're using these. Perhaps they're even standardized among the electronics people. But just the same, all those things are virtually new. And computers and electronic stuff is just in its infancy. It's going to keep right on increasing at a terrific rate. I couldn't use that because I'm doing a regional dictionary, and he knew it. He said, you might be interested in these, when he sent them to me. So I've just simply sent them on to the head of the Merriam-Webster dictionaries in Springfield. He's a man, we exchange things. He sends me things, and I send him things. In any case, I send these to him because he can use them. But the Webster Dictionary has got to the point where they're adding words to their file at such a terrific rate that they don't know when they're going to get out the next new international. And they don't know what kind of limitations they're going to have to put on. People have complained to them. There are too many technical words in your dictionary. Why don't you put in just the literary words? Well, they may come to that. You may have dictionaries of literary words and dictionaries of technical words and dictionaries of electronics words or something else. We're going to have to come to something like that because the dictionary that tries to put in everything that, or all that most of the people would be interested in and have to find out about are just simply getting too difficult to make. It takes 25 years to revise one of those anyway. Well, if the language is increasing at this terrific rate, what does it mean? Why is it increasing at this rate? Because language always follows the society that it serves. It doesn't exist apart from a society that it serves. It exists in people's heads. And of course, when they write it down, it exists on paper in a certain form. But language is something that exists in people's heads and on their lips, of course, when they express it. And as we find new things being invented or new conditions coming up, and we have to have words to express them, to talk about them, to discuss them, to get control of them, we have to have new words, or we have to change meanings so that they cover a new sphere that they didn't cover beforehand. And what happens? New words, they keep coming in. I didn't know the word Ayatollah a year ago. I'd never heard it in my life. But everybody knows it now, for better or for worse. And so it is. That's just one. Thousands of words are coming in all the time. American Speech Magazine prints twice a year, prints a list called Among the New Words. I have the list of the most recent issue. It has about 12 words based on Watergate. All the columnists have been punning on the word Watergate. They have water this and water that and water the next thing. I couldn't tell you all of them, but they're all in one little article called Among the New Words, which comes out twice a year in American Speech Magazine, published by the American Dialect Society. Let me come back to the dictionary. I mentioned this business of a great many new words coming in because it indicates this very rapid increase in the range of our language. What we are losing to some extent is the older words, or else in some places local words are being forgotten. Now this is not anything which, well, for example, yesterday I spent most of my day with a crew from NBC who wanted to make a program for the Today Show, and it ought to come on Wednesday or Thursday next week. They spent 5 hours photographing us and interviewing me. I was exhausted at the end of it. Don't know how I got here. They are putting it on. They wanted to know about all these words, and they asked me repeatedly, don't you think that television is homogenizing the language and killing it? Don't you think that all these local words are going to disappear completely? Well, I told them, I don't think it's quite as bad as that. Of course, some local words are always disappearing. Always. There's lots and lots of words that Shakespeare used that nobody's used since then. The only reason we know them is that we have to learn Shakespeare in school. And sometimes when you put on a Shakespeare play, a producer who isn't too sure of his audience will change a few things so that the audience will understand them and they won't be quite in Hamlet's own words. But there is a lot of danger, you might say, of homogenization of language. This is where this jargonish language comes in. There's a tremendous lot of this jargonish, formulaic language that people just learn and say, and you know. Did you get it? But that isn't all there is to it. There is still a lot of local language. And I told the television people this. I said, look, suppose a man is born in the middle of Alabama in a small town. I don't know why I'm picking on Alabama tonight. It could be anywhere else. Let's say Iowa. He's born in a small town in Iowa, and he has a normal small town upbringing, and his folks are people who run a little store and so forth. And he talks the local language, and everybody understands him. Well, he decides that he's going to go off and get a law degree. Where's the best place to get a law degree? Well, it's Columbia or Harvard or somewhere. So he goes there and gets himself a law degree, and he hears Columbia University English, which is quite a bit different from Iowa, I assure you, whether you've heard it or not. Columbia background, and he forgets all about that. Perhaps the Brooklynese that his co-students used. He forgets about that, except as something that he can make fun of. But there are these local pressures toward conformity and continuity. And so the language is not going to change all that fast. The local language is, to some extent, disappearing. I suppose what you have to do if you want to follow language change is to see what the young people are doing. The young people are the ones who change the language. They don't learn what their elders used, or they have new concerns that their elders didn't have. They have new ways of looking at things, new values. And the language adapts itself to that, of course. Language always adapts itself. Language very seldom does any directing or any forcing, very seldom, except language that's deliberately propagandistic. But language left to itself mostly follows, almost all the time follows the use that people want to make of it. So the young people are the ones who change language, partly by leaving out what their parents said, grandparents said, and partly by adding new things of their own. Now let's get to some examples. Since I've been talking about new words, suppose I take a question that we had for the dictionary. I better tell you a little bit about the dictionary before I come back to this question, and some others. But the dictionary attempts to gather all of the words and expressions that we possibly can that are used in only one part of the country, all 50 states. That's a rather large territory, and it took us 5 years sending field workers out, trained in phonetics and in linguistics generally, to go to chosen communities, 1,002 as it turned out. The 2 were for extra for safety. We had planned on 1,000 communities with a very big questionnaire. The questionnaire is that thick, and it has 1,847 questions in it. And they cover all of the natural concerns of everyday life, starting out with time and weather and topography and buildings and furnishings and domestic animals and farms and cookery and food and plants and birds and just everything that everybody would normally meet with in everyday life. And we got the same questions framed, and every question was framed in a certain way, and the field workers were told, ask the question that way, don't vary from the way it is in the questionnaire. So that we should have had, and I think on the whole do have, exact comparability throughout the country. The only place where you don't have it is where people refused to answer the question, or said, I don't know, or else they made a joke of it. You know, you'd ask them a serious question and they'd just ha-ha about it and give you some sort of off-the-line answer. Or else they misunderstood the field worker and gave him something that just was at odds with it. But apart from those, and those were relatively small, we got a tremendous number of comparable answers for 50 states, so that we are now able, with computerization, to make maps in which we show the distributions of all, we can show the distributions of any answer we got out of a 2.5 million answer response. There's nobody else has that kind of information about the actual daily use of American English by native-born Americans in specific communities, the communities themselves having been chosen so that the distribution of 1,000 communities would cover the density of the population throughout the United States. In other words, we have more where the population is thick and fewer where the population is thin. And we tried also to balance it out on, we have about as many men as women, and we balanced it out on the question of ages, 3 different ages, so that we have a relatively smaller number of young people, a much relatively larger number of older people, so as to make sure that we could get some of the older expressions. And then, of course, the sexes are balanced, and we got racial differences also, though that doesn't affect language a great deal, but we felt it ought to be a factor we ought to take into account. We also have the occupations of people. We have something about their degree of education. And all these factors can be mapped now. I can make a map for any of those factors and for geography within less than a minute on the computer. And we have now some hundreds of maps made, and they have revealed things to us that were quite surprising. We had no idea that certain words were regional and certain others were throughout the country. Well, I'll give you some examples. And I wish I could show you some maps, but time simply forbids it. We'll have them in the dictionary when they're done. We have lots of maps, lots and lots of maps. I hope you like maps. I do. Well, I was going to tell you about this word that puts the young and the old in contrast. If I had been asked this question, I would say the question was, what do you call the kind of small and insignificant place that's away from other places? That's not quite the way it was said, but it means the same thing. And of course, I would have said out in the sticks, or out in the tall and uncut, or out in the backwoods, or, you know, expressions like that. You all have expressions for that. And then the young people were all saying out in the boondocks, or out in the boonies. And I even got some wonderful blends of boonies with some other words, but never mind. The point is, why should the young people be saying that? Well, we looked into the history of the word boondock and found that it was a Filipino word from the Tagalog language, that it had been picked up by the U.S. Armed Forces, especially the Marines in the Philippines, and that they had brought it back. It hadn't got any kind of currency before Second World War, but in the Second World War, it suddenly, in the Pacific area, it suddenly was all over the place. Everybody was in the boonies, the boondocks. It's the young people, it's the teenagers who made it into boonies. But boondocks was very well known then in the late 1940s. And the Marines even carried it to the point of giving the name to a type of footwear they had. When they were going into a rough country, they'd wear their boondockers, a kind of shoes for that kind of terrain. Well, I see some people smiling as if they were ex-Marines. In any case, boondock, just in the Tagalog language, simply means the mountains. And if you're down on the coast and the mountains are away from you and they look pretty rough and you have maneuvers up there, but you stay away from them as much as you can if you want to be comfortable, the boondocks was out back of beyond. That's another expression I used to use, back of beyond. Well, there is one sort of thing in which we got the explanation pretty well. But when we asked the question, it was only the young people among our answerers, among our informants, only the younger people who gave us boondocks. And we got I think 50 or more different expressions for it from the middle-aged and older people. There is some age grading, as we call it. There definitely is age grading. We got age grading on quite a number of things. The geographical grading is also very interesting. Let me tell you about some of the old words that are surviving, you'd never believe it, in the United States. Is there anybody here from Rhode Island? No? Well, yes, all right. Now, did you ever go fishing? Just plain ordinary fishing with a hook and line in Rhode Island? No. All right. Well, you had the wrong kind of grandfather. But in any case, you see, the fishing terms aren't learned from books. Not just ordinary angling terms. They're learned from the person who takes you fishing, whoever it is, some member of your family or some favorite uncle or something, takes you fishing. And you learn the terms from him or her. Lots of enthusiastic female fishermen that I know, fisherwomen. Is that the right word, fisherwomen? So in Rhode Island and almost nowhere else, the word eastworm is the word that's used for the ordinary bait fishing worm. Angleworm is the common thing throughout New England. Eastworm is the name there. Angledog down in the southwest in Connecticut. You get angledog. And, of course, fishworm and redworm and rainworm and so forth. Rainworm turns up in Wisconsin, too, in lots of places. Wherever there's Germanic background, you can expect rainworm to turn up. It's just simply Regenwurm translated into English. That's all it is. But it was in English before it was, let us say, before the reinforcement of German population. It was still being used in English as an English term. And you know why they're called rainworms, of course. Anybody who's ever dug for what some of the New Englanders call night walkers would know. You see signs along the road coming from Maine westward. You'll see signs along the road that don't say night crawlers. They say night walkers. Well, I thought I could leave that to your imaginations and your linguistic knowledge. All right, eastworm goes back to at least the 12th century. I've used it. I used a text in my Anglo-Saxon classes in which we translate something from Alfric's little story about, he has a thing set in the monastery where young fellows are being catechized. They're being asked, what do you do and what do you do? They're the fellows who work in a monastery. And these fellows answer, well, I'm a fisherman. And what do you do? Well, I bait my hooks and I go out in the river and so forth and so on. And the word that's used for bait is ass, E-A-S in Old English, ass. Well, it simply is eastworm. in Rhode Island. It's been continued at the verbal level from father to son, from son to son, and so forth, all the way down. And that's a very ancient word that's still alive in the United States. I've tried to find it in the English dialect dictionary, and it is in very limited use in England. I suppose you might say it's in very limited use in the United States too. But at least it's still alive. That's rather interesting. Switching to the other coast, I came across an interesting word, which is apparently also quite old, though not as old as eastworm. But what are people calling the glove compartment in their cars up in Oregon and Washington, and maybe in Idaho? A jockey box. Several people have reported that to me, always from that upper northwest corner. What is a jockey box? Well, if you go back, it's a little tool chest that sat under the seat on a prairie schooner or any kind of wagon. They had a little box with tools and extra bolts and nuts and nails and hammers and so forth. And that was what the young fellow sat on when he was on the jockey box. He was the jockey. And the jockey box has been transferred to wagons, and now it's been transferred to the glove compartment in the car. You can tell that the person who made that transfer was probably closely related to one of the pioneers who came over in a prairie schooner. All right, there's one. That goes back at least to pioneer times, let's say 150 years, 200 years. For the Northwest, 150 only. I ran across a still more ancient word, if you're interested in this, a still more ancient word, one that goes back into early Germanic times and came through Anglo-Saxon in one of the forms. It's also in Old High German and some of the other early Germanic languages. Did you ever know how to make vinegar in your own home? Well, you take a mason jar or something like it, some kind of a container like that, a crock, and you put in some water, and you put in some sugar or molasses or, long sweetening, which is another name for molasses, where the places where they make it, either from sorghum or sugar cane or something else. Anyway, you put in some of that, and then you have to have a bee. The bee is a little piece of yeast, a special type of yeast. You put that yeast in there, and it starts to work on the sugar or the sweet, whatever it is. It starts working on that, and it builds up a little gas on itself, which is lighter than the water. So that starts this little piece of yeast going up through the water in the jar. When it gets to the top, it releases the gas and, of course, sinks down again. So you have this up and down motion of a little piece of thing like that, which is just a little lump of yeast. And it's sort of mushy and unpleasant, but it makes vinegar. So everybody who made their own vinegar at home had this kind of thing. Some people called it mother of vinegar. That may be a more familiar term, mother of vinegar. And in the Germanic languages, it is that. What's the word for vinegar? It's, what is it? I've forgotten. Anyway, it's that plus Mutter. I've forgotten the thing for the moment. It'll come back to me. In any case, vinegar mother, obviously the mother was the thing that produced the vinegar, and so that makes perfectly good sense. But why a bee? Well, if you get back far enough in the Germanic languages, you'll find the word bane, B-E-E-N is the way it's spelled in the dictionaries, bane, which meant yeast. So that a piece of this yeast, which was bean, came to be thought of as a bee. Why? Because it kept flying up and down, up and down through the water. And furthermore, I suppose maybe if they put honey in instead of vinegar, of molasses or sugar, then it might have another association with a bee. But whatever it was, they called it a vinegar bee. We've got records of that going way back, and we've picked up several examples of it. And it's also found in the Pennsylvania German area, having been brought in from two sources, one through Pennsylvania German and the other through the older English forms. But they all go back, of course, to this ancient Germanic word. We've got a great many of these things. There are thousands of them. It's just a matter of almost random choice that I tell you some of these. The ones I like are the ones not only which demonstrate the tenacity of dialect words in some cases, but also those that illustrate the imagination that people have in creating, or the reasons why they keep these words alive. In West Virginia, one name for mushrooms is dryland fish. Well, I've never thought of fish when I ate mushrooms. It has a sort of a strange flavor. It's not fish flavor, it's mushroom flavor. But just the same, I can see that they might call it dryland fish if they weren't very familiar with fish, certainly not with sea fish, as they aren't in West Virginia. It must be that slightly musty smell and flavor that you get from some mushrooms that make them think of a fishy smell. It is used, we've got it from several different people quite independently. We don't invent these things, we just collect them. The temptation to invent them, of course, does bite some of our informants. I've had people tell me with a perfectly straight face that a thing meant so-and-so because so-and-so. And then when I investigated and pushed them back, well, they said, that was a nice explanation, I kind of liked it. I made it up myself. How do you like if you wanted to say something was done to utmost perfection, to the very last detail, just the very last detail, how would you say it? Well, this man said it was done to a gnat's heel. I like that. That's real imagination. Something we came upon, something that's very, very new in the language, because the plant has not been introduced for very long. You all know about the kudzu vine. It flourishes down south. It was brought in the somewhat fatuous notion that it was going to help with preventing erosion on banks. It prevents erosion all right, but that's not all it does. It grows so fast that it takes over trees and banks and everything else. It's just an awful pest, and they keep chopping it down. But anyway, that's the kudzu vine. It's become pronounced kudja in some places in the south, the kudja vine. But the name I like for it is yardonite, which refers to the speed with which it grows. Yardonite. That shows real imagination, not to mention observation. At a certain time, perhaps 100 years ago, when schools were not very numerous, and people who had a little schooling made as much of it as they could, and sometimes too much, but anybody who could prate a few Latin words, of course, would be able to put it over on certain others, even if it was very bad legal Latin or something like that. If he could say, a medical Latin was also one of the great offenders. If he could say something medical or medical sounding in Latin, he was better off certainly than his patients. But anyway, some of the terms that we've run across that are the result of this kind of false Latin are things like gollywobbles. How many of you have ever had the gollywobbles? I had them. We call them collywobbles, but it's the same thing. It just means the stomach upset. That's all. That's all. What in England would be called colic, but it's gollywobbles to me, and it's simply bad Latin for cholera morbus. I'd much rather have gollywobbles than cholera morbus, I assure you. We found that from several different sources. In Maryland alone, I found a strange word used to indicate complete drunkenness. And it was a person who has simply gone out from drunkenness. And it was mania pocha, he said, mania pocha. He had mania pocha. It means he had delirium tremens. That's what it means. But in any case, I had a hard time tracking that one down. But I got hold of a classics professor in Madison who also teaches a course in medical Latin and Greek. And so all the doctors have to take it. Anybody in the medical school has to take that course required. In any case, he finally tracked it down for me. It's mania a potu. In other words, mania from drinking, from too many potations. It's still alive in Maryland. We picked it up from 3 or 4 places around in the Baltimore area. We haven't found it anywhere else. Maniapocha, they said. Well, that's a very high-sounding name for what it is. People around here who go fishing, at least people, let's say around here because I'm not sure, but at least people in Minnesota or Wisconsin who go fishing keep running across a kind of little fly. It's very minute. It'll get through any kind of fly nets and so forth, and it stings like mad. They've translated an Indian name for it, and it's called an osium. That's what the Indians named it when they were learning some English. An osium. Practically invisible. I hope you will help me with this word. That isn't medical Latin, by the way. I hope you will help me with this word. Has any of you ever heard the word katish? Did I hear yeah?
Yes.
Yes. What does it mean to you?
I'm not sure. I come from a Chicago neighborhood.
Good.
There was
Good.
quite a mixed variety of people from all different ethnic
Well,
backgrounds, and that's where I heard it.
I've had it from one person in Chicago, from a lady in Madison, from a lady in Milwaukee. So that's a fairly restricted area. And katish meant very stylish and fashionable. Oh, isn't that a katish dress? That sort of thing. See? Or the girl said, I liked your katish. Pardon me?
I've heard it from someone in the East, too, from
You have.
just the New York area.
Well, it probably came out with a style, but whatever it was, I was delighted when she told me that and started checking on it at once and asking all the ladies, have you ever heard the word katish? And a few of them have. It's not much used anymore, but then it's a nice kind of word. I think it'll get in the dictionary. I don't know how time is going here. You stop me when you're ready. I could keep on, of course, until, let us say, until the cows come home. Two of the things that I've run across recently that I rather like in Wisconsin, the word nibby. Do you know what nibby means? It means nosy. She's kind of nibby. I wouldn't have too much to do with her. She's kind of nibby. She sticks her nose in where it doesn't belong. Well, nib, of course, on a pen is the point of the pen, and the nib, technically, of a bird is the point of its beak. Ornithologists would know that use of it, but it goes back to the Anglo-Saxon word neb, N-E-B, which means the nose. That's the word for the nose, neb. So nibby is still going strong, and I suppose if you keep it active, it should keep right on going strong for a while. Keep on being nibby, I mean. One thing that surprised me quite a bit was from several Southern correspondents, we had the expression, oh, she thinks he hangs the moon. She thinks he hangs the moon, hung the moon. She thinks he hung the moon. This means she has an inordinate, unbelievably favorable opinion of him. She thinks he hung the moon. Well, now, he would have had to be pretty tall to do that, but in any case, that's the idea. You have to say it about 2 other people. You don't say it about yourself. I think he hangs the moon. No, no, no. You're saying it about a commentary on 2 other people. She thinks he hung the moon, or he thinks she hung the moon. But I think it's mostly said by women about men. I like that kind of thing. It reveals things about human beings.
That might be from Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare.
From Midsummer Night's Dream. I haven't tracked it back, but I'll take the suggestion. I could go on with this forever. How many of you know the word ufta? All right, good, good. I've seen it on a bumper sticker recently. It's, of course, Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, we'd say it's a Wisconsin word because the largest number of Norwegian immigrants to the United States came to Wisconsin, and we have a very good share of them, and they're saying ufta all the time. Excuse me?
What does it mean?
Ufta, oh, it's an interjection. You can't really define interjections. You can sometimes translate them, but you can't really define them. What you have to say is something circuitous, like, said on occasions of great wrath or something like that. Ufta just means, oh, surprise, astonishment, Sometimes I detect at the back of it a kind of "I told you so." It's what you could have expected, that kind of thing. That's what I suspect at the back of it, but I'm still listening. Anybody who wants to give me a demonstration afterwards will be welcomed. A French word that has come over from Canada into the Upper Peninsula of Michigan fairly recently, and which is creeping into Wisconsin too, is the word chook. It means a stocking cap or something very much like it used by skiers and other people who got to get out into the snow in the cold weather. A chook. Have you ever heard it? You're not far enough north. Well, we hear it in Wisconsin, and of course the Upper Peninsula seems to be the place that got it first, right from across the Canadian border, across the lake, that is. Anyway, a chook is simply the French word toque, T-O-Q-U-E, which has been passed through French-Canadian pronunciation and has come out in that form. That's a recent, quite recent loan word. One thing on which I got an answer only 4 days ago. It's a thing that we have tried to explain for a long, long time. It is, there's a dead cat on the line, which means what Marcellus meant in Hamlet when he said, there's something rotten in the state of Denmark. It's exactly the same meaning, but there's a dead cat on the line. We picked that up first in Georgia. We picked it up in South Carolina. The people who told me about it, well, one woman, a black woman who teaches at the University of South Carolina, a PhD, who gives me all kinds of wonderful leads, said that she heard her hairdresser use the term. She checked on it with her. Oh, yes, she said, we use that all the time. So she herself, the teacher, wrote up to her mother, who was in Virginia. Oh, yes, I always used that. Well, what does it mean? What kind of a line is it? What kind of a cat is it? Cat means so many different things, especially in black usage. So I finally got the explanation from a man in Louisiana 4 days ago. He says, if you're a fisherman, and if you put out a trot line, you know what a trot line is? You have a great long series with different lines going down with hooks at the bottom of each of them all the way around. And if you have a trot line, then you have to go from hook to hook, taking off the fish you've caught and rebaiting your hooks and following the whole series around. Well, if you are going out into the swamp or into the bayous or somewhere and you see a dead cat on the line, you know that somebody hasn't made his rounds, he hasn't picked up his fish, and there's something wrong back at his house. Maybe he's sick, maybe he's broken his leg, maybe somebody's died. You don't know, but there's trouble back there. And a dead cat on the line means a dead catfish on a fish line. One of the people who, with imagination, wrote into me as soon as I asked the question in a publication. He wrote into me and said, oh, I know what that is. I know what that is. It's when you have a party line and the second person is listening without talking. That's a dead cat on your line. I thought that was very ingenious, and I wrote to him and said, have you got some proof of that? Oh, no, he said, I made it up. I think I'd better stop there. I'll tell you just this much. We hope our dictionary will be finished if we get sufficient support. If we're being supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities chiefly. We also get some from foundations, but chiefly the National Endowment. And they've been very good to us. But there's a limit to even endowment's patience, and we hope we can finish within 4 years and get us off their line. And we won't be a dead cat, I assure you. But in any case, we hope that we can finish in about 4 years. And if our funds are not reduced, if we can keep on with our present 10 editors, if I could even add a couple more editors, I could get it done maybe in 3 years. But we are only down, we hope to finish down through the letter G by the end of this year. But there are some awfully long letters after that. The letter S is eternal, absolutely eternal. And so we're getting on with it. But now if you have any questions that I can answer, I will conclude with those. But let me say only, I hope you believe, after some of what I've said, that the language of the United States is definitely not dying. Definitely not. It's flourishing. Thank you.